You stupid knocker! The racial slur explodes from Billionaire CEO Charles Blackstone's mouth like a gunshot in the Ritz-Carlton ballroom, where 200 millionaires freeze with champagne glasses halfway to their lips. The black waitress on her knees before him, Naomi Washington, 26, earning $15 an hour, doesn't flinch as Dom Perignon drips from his $50,000 Armani suit onto her uniform. Instead, she looks up at the man worth $5 billion with an expression that shouldn't exist on the face of someone he's just humiliated. Pity, mixed with something far more dangerous. What Charles Blackstone doesn't know, what his rage blinds him from seeing, is that the silver-haired gentleman in the corner, William Sterling, the man holding the pen to a $2 billion deal, has just set down his whiskey glass with the careful precision of someone making a life-altering decision. The billionaire CEO has no idea he's just committed financial suicide in front of the one person who matters most. In exactly 24 hours, those 5 words will cost him everything: his company, his fortune, his future. But how? How could a waitress he considers worthless destroy an empire built over decades? The answer is already in motion, hidden in plain sight. 6 months earlier, Naomi Washington had walked through the gilded doors of the Ritz-Carlton Manhattan with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from hunger. The job interview at 10 in the morning meant she'd skipped breakfast to save the $2 subway fare, walking 40 blocks in worn flats that cut into her heels with every step. $15 an hour to serve champagne to billionaires. It was more than the 3 part-time jobs she'd been juggling combined, and it came with health insurance, real insurance that might actually cover Marcus's therapy sessions. Marcus, her baby brother, though at 19 he towered over her when he could stand. Cerebral palsy had twisted his brilliant mind inside a body that betrayed him daily, turning simple tasks into Olympic events. $3,000 a month for specialized care, not counting the medications that insurance companies deemed experimental despite 20 years of proven results. Their parents had left them nothing but debt and each other. Their mother to cancer when Naomi was 16, their father to a bottle and a highway median 2 years later. The hiring manager at the Ritz had looked at her resume. Brooklyn Community College dropout, 5 years of scattered service jobs, and seen exactly what he expected to see. Another desperate black woman who'd smile pretty and stay invisible. "Can you handle difficult guests?" he'd asked, barely glancing up from his phone. Naomi had thought of Marcus, of the eviction notice taped to their door, of the Stanford basketball scholarship she'd torn up the day their father died. "I can handle anything," she'd said, and meant it. But there was another reason Naomi chose the Ritz-Carlton, something she'd never told anyone except the man who signed her paychecks every 2 weeks through a shell company that traced back to Sterling Enterprises. The email had arrived the night before her interview, from an address she didn't recognize. "My dear daughter, take the job. Watch. Listen. Learn how power shows its true face when it thinks no one important is looking. Your time will come. W.S." She'd almost deleted it as spam. Would have, if not for the attachment. A photograph from 15 years ago. 11-year-old Naomi in a Brooklyn group home, playing chess with a silver-haired man in a $1,000 suit who'd wandered in during a charity tour. William Sterling had spent 4 hours that day teaching her the Czech Benoni defense, and before leaving, he'd whispered something that made no sense to a grieving child. Sometimes the most powerful piece on the board is the one everyone ignores. Now, serving champagne to men who spent more on watches than most families saw in a lifetime, Naomi understood. She became a student of power, cataloging every tell, every pattern. Charles Blackstone always arrived 15 minutes early, always sat at table 7, always ordered the Dom Perignon 2002. He measured his worth in the fear he could inspire in others, the way conversations died when he entered a room, the way assistants scurried like roaches when he snapped his fingers. She'd watched him reduce a sommelier to tears over a microscopic lipstick smudge on a glass, seen him fire a coat check girl for taking 30 seconds too long, observed how he kept a running tally of humiliations like a collector maintaining his portfolio. But she'd also noticed something else, the deals that fell through after his outbursts, the investors who mysteriously withdrew after witnessing his management style. Power built on fear was like champagne, effervescent, intoxicating, and quick to go flat. The night before the charity gala, Naomi had received another email. No words this time, just a subject line. Tomorrow, everything changes. She'd stared at it while Marcus slept in his specialized bed, machines beeping softly in the darkness of their two-bedroom apartment. Change. After 6 months of watching, of being invisible, of letting entitled men grab her wrist and whisper suggestions that made her skin crawl, was she ready for change? That morning, she'd helped Marcus with his exercises, his face contorting with effort as he fought to make his muscles obey. "You're the strongest person I know," she'd told him, and he'd smiled that crooked smile that broke and rebuilt her heart daily. "Nah," he'd managed, each word a victory. "That's you, Naomi. You're gonna change the world someday." Standing in the service corridor of the Ritz-Carlton, adjusting the uniform that marked her as nobody important, Naomi had thought about chessmen and power, about visibility and invisibility, about the email promising change. She didn't know that in 3 hours, Charles Blackstone would give her the perfect opening. She didn't know that her 18-hour shifts and aching feet had all been leading to a moment of spectacular implosion. All she knew was that tonight felt different. The air itself seemed charged with possibility, the way it does before lightning strikes. And in the main ballroom, William Sterling was already seated at his corner table, watching the door with the patience of a grandmaster who'd already calculated 30 moves ahead. The presidential ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton Manhattan sprawled across 5,000 square feet of orchestrated opulence, a stage where America's elite performed their nightly rituals of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers imported from Baccarat cast rainbow fractals across tables draped in Irish linen, while a string quartet played Mozart beneath a ceiling hand-painted by artists flown in from Florence. The $2 million Persian rug beneath their feet had once graced a Shah's palace. Now it caught champagne drops from glasses that cost more than most Americans' monthly rent. Tonight's performance was the Sterling Foundation Annual Gala, a $10 million charity auction where tax write-offs masqueraded as philanthropy. 200 of Manhattan's most powerful had gathered, each table a small nation-state of influence. There were tech moguls who'd disrupted entire industries before breakfast, senators who shaped laws between courses, Hollywood directors who manufactured dreams for global consumption, and influencers whose single posts could shift markets or destroy reputations. At the epicenter sat Table 7, the ground zero of tonight's real business. Charles Blackstone commanded the space like a general, surveying conquered territory, his presence making the air itself feel thinner. At 38, he'd built Blackstone Technologies from a garage startup into a $5 billion empire, crushing competitors with the efficiency of a machine designed for war. His origin story, middle-class kid makes good, had been sanitized for Forbes profiles and TED Talks, scrubbed clean of the casualties left in his wake. The truth lived in his body language, in the way he held his shoulders like weapons, in how his eyes calculated the worth of everyone who approached. His father, a high school math teacher, had died of a stress-induced heart attack after being laid off at 52, leaving behind a mortgage and a lesson Charles had carved into his DNA. Kindness was weakness, and weakness was death. His mother, a night shift nurse, had worked herself into early dementia trying to keep their house. Charles had watched them both choose compassion over ambition, watched it kill them by degrees, and sworn he'd never make the same mistake. The Bezos deal? William Sterling's voice cut through Charles's reverie. The old man sat across from him, nursing a whiskey that probably cost more than Naomi's weekly paycheck. At 72, Sterling controlled a fund worth $50 billion, making him the kind of man who could reshape entire economies with a phone call. Tonight, he held the keys to Blackstone Technologies' future, a $2 billion investment that would take the company public and cement Charles's place among the titans. Wrapped up last quarter, Charles replied, his tone suggesting the 8-figure deal was as mundane as ordering coffee. Jeff finally saw reason about the logistics integration. Sometimes you have to show people the cliff before they understand they're already falling. Sterling's expression remained unreadable, those grey eyes that had witnessed decades of boardroom bloodshed giving away nothing. Around them, 6 other investors from Dubai, London, and Zurich listened with the attention of courtiers watching a king. These were men who measured success in destroyed competitors and broken unions, who understood that in the ecosystem of extreme wealth, you were either predator or prey. Speaking of falling, Charles continued, his voice rising just enough to command the surrounding table's attention. Did you hear about Davidson's little problem with the SEC? Turns out his charity was more creative with its accounting than his CFO. The laughter that followed was sharp as crystal breaking, the sound of hyenas celebrating another corpse in the kingdom of plenty. This was Charles in his element, performing cruelty as entertainment, wielding humiliation like a conductor's baton. He'd already warmed up on Sarah Mitchell, his Harvard-educated assistant, when she'd arrived 5 minutes late with the contract drafts. Harvard must have lowered their standards, he'd said, loud enough for half the room to hear. Though I suppose they need to fill their diversity quotas somehow. Sarah, blonde and blue-eyed as a recruitment poster, had flushed red and mumbled apologies, not understanding she'd been degraded simply because Charles needed to demonstrate his power before the main event. Naomi watched it all from her position by the service station, her practiced invisibility allowing her to observe the ecosystem of power in its natural habitat. She'd learned to read the room's geography like a battlefield map. The mayor's table, where zoning laws were rewritten between appetizers. The pharmaceutical executive's corner, where they casually discussed price hikes that would bankrupt families like hers. The senator's section, where democracy was auctioned to the highest bidder over cognac. But her attention kept returning to Sterling. For 6 months she'd served him champagne and watched him watch others, noting how he catalogued every cruelty, every small betrayal of character. He had a tell, a slight tightening around his eyes when he witnessed something that offended him, though he never intervened. Until tonight, Naomi had wondered why a man with his power tolerated the Charles Blackstones of the world. Now, feeling the weight of his occasional glances, she began to understand. Sterling wasn't tolerating. He was waiting. The same way she'd been waiting. Invisibility her camouflage, service her cover story. In this room full of predators, they were both playing longer games. The evening's charity auction proceeded with mechanical enthusiasm. A week at a senator's Hamptons estate, $200,000. A walk-on role in a Netflix series, $500,000. Pocket change thrown at problems these same people had helped create, tax-deductible band-aids on systemic wounds. Charles bid aggressively, not out of generosity, but because winning was the only metric that mattered. Each victory was punctuated by his signature move, a dismissive wave that reduced the losing bidders to background noise. You know what separates winners from losers? Charles asked the table, 3 drinks making his voice sharper. Losers think business is about relationships. Winners understand it's about dominance. Every interaction is a zero-sum game. Either you're taking or you're being taken. Interesting philosophy, Sterling observed, swirling his whiskey. Your father was a teacher, wasn't he? Mine was a janitor. Cleaned offices for 30 years. Never missed a day. Something flickered across Charles's face. annoyance at the personal revelation, confusion at its relevance. Sterling continued. He used to tell me that the way a man treats those who can do nothing for him reveals everything worth knowing about his character. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Charles's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming against the table in a pattern Naomi recognized. The prelude to an explosion. He hated being lectured, hated even more the implication that his success needed moral justification. In his world, money was the only morality that mattered. "With all due respect, William," Charles said, his smile sharp as a blade, "your father's generation didn't understand scale. They thought small, acted small, died small. The world's moved past their fairy tales about character and hard work. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to use the facilities before we close our little arrangement." He stood, straightening his suit jacket with the precision of a man preparing for battle. As he moved through the crowd, Naomi caught something in Sterling's expression. Satisfaction? Anticipation? The old man touched his phone, typing something brief, then settled back to wait. The collision course was set. Charles Blackstone, apex predator of the financial world, navigating the party like a shark through schools of smaller fish. Naomi Washington, invisible servant, moving with a tray of champagne toward table 7. William Sterling, puppet master, watching all the strings align. In 90 seconds, their trajectories would intersect. In 90 seconds, Charles would make the mistake that would cost him everything. And somewhere in the quantum space between accident and destiny, fate was already laughing at the brutal poetry of it all. At 9:47 p.m., Naomi Washington balanced 12 crystal flutes of Dom Perignon 2002 on a silver tray that caught the ballroom's light like a mirror. Each glass held $1,000 of champagne, more money than she'd make this month, balanced on her fingertips as she navigated through clouds of perfume and seas of designer gowns. The weight was nothing compared to the exhaustion of a 16-hour shift, or the ache in her feet from heels that management insisted made the staff look more professional. She moved toward table 7 with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned to be both visible and invisible, present enough to serve, absent enough to be forgotten. The champagne glowed golden in the crystal, tiny bubbles rising like reversed rain, each pop at the surface worth more than the subway fare she'd counted out that morning in crumpled bills and borrowed quarters. The collision began with joy. A Dubai investor, flush with the promise of profits that would buy another yacht, another mansion, another mistress, leapt to his feet with the enthusiasm of a man whose life had never taught him consequences. His hand swept outward in a gesture of triumph, catching Naomi's elbow just as she reached the table's edge. Time dilated. The tray tilted. Physics took over. 3 glasses of Dom Perignon, $3,000 of liquid status, arced through the air in perfect parabolas. Naomi watched them fall with the helpless clarity of nightmares, her body already moving to minimize damage, her mind calculating angles and outcomes. 2 glasses shattered against the table, sending champagne across the white linen like golden blood. The third found its target with the precision of guided missiles. Charles Blackstone felt the champagne hit him like a slap from God. It cascaded down his chest, soaking through the Armani suit he'd bought to intimidate, pooling in his lap with the warmth of public humiliation. For a moment, the entire ballroom froze. 200 of New York's most powerful holding their breath, waiting to see which way the violence would flow. His face transformed in stages. Surprise melted into disbelief, disbelief crystallized into rage, and rage exploded into something primal that stripped away 40 years of cultivated sophistication. The veins in his neck stood out like cables under tension. His hands clenched into fists that had never thrown a punch, but suddenly wanted nothing more than to destroy something, anything, to transfer this humiliation onto someone else's flesh. In that instant, a memory crashed through his defenses. 12 years old, standing in the cafeteria while Brad Chen poured chocolate milk over his head. The entire school laughing, pointing, recording. That's what you get for thinking you're better than us, welfare boy. The shame of it, the helplessness, the promise he'd made to himself that night. Never again would anyone make him feel small. Never again would he be the victim. "You stupid knocker!" The words erupted from somewhere deeper than thought, from the dark place where childhood trauma crystallized into adult cruelty. "Can't even serve champagne properly. They'll hire anyone these days." His voice crescendoed, filling the ballroom with poison. "This suit costs more than your entire worthless life. I've built empires while your kind serves drinks. Get on your knees where you belong and clean this up." His hand shot out, grabbing Naomi's wrist with the force of possession. She'd felt this grip before, not his specifically, but the same entitlement made flesh, the same assumption that her body was public property. His fingers pressed into her skin hard enough to leave marks, yanking her downward, trying to force her to kneel in the spreading puddle of champagne and broken crystal. But Naomi Washington did not kneel. Instead, she looked up at him with eyes that held no fear, no anger, no tears. What Charles saw there made his rage stutter for just a moment. Pity. Pure, undiluted pity, as if she were looking at a rabid dog that didn't know it was already dying. As if she could see through his expensive suit to the frightened 12-year-old still running from cafeteria humiliation. As if she knew something about his future that he didn't. The ballroom had become a theater of witness. 30% of the guests had their phones out, recording every second with the reflexive instinct of a generation that understood documentation as power. The small red lights of their cameras dotted the darkness like predator eyes. 20% sat in shocked silence, their own prejudices warring with their sense of public propriety. But 50%, a full half of the room, had turned their attention to one man. William Sterling rose from his chair with the deliberate slowness of tectonic plates shifting. Each movement was calculated for effect, from the way he set down his whiskey glass to how he adjusted his tie. The room's attention split between the violent tableau at table 7 and the silver-haired man now walking toward it with the measured pace of an executioner approaching the scaffold. "Charles!" Sterling's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Just one word, but it carried the weight of verdict, of judgment, of consequences arriving at the speed of justice. Charles's head snapped toward him, rage momentarily redirected. "William, this girl, she—" But Sterling had already dismissed him, turning instead to Naomi, who still stood frozen in Charles's grip. Behind them, phones captured every frame. The contrast was cinematic. Charles Blackstone, red-faced and champagne-soaked, his mask of civility shattered to reveal the monster beneath. Naomi Washington, dignified even in distress, her uniform stained but her humanity intact. And William Sterling, approaching like fate itself, about to speak words that would rewrite the trajectory of 3 lives. Sarah Mitchell watched from her position by the wall, remembering her own humiliation an hour earlier, seeing in Naomi's eyes the same exhaustion she felt every day working for a man who viewed cruelty as communication. The waitstaff had stopped pretending to work, standing frozen with their trays like soldiers awaiting orders. Even the string quartet had ceased playing, Mozart dying mid-measure, as reality intruded on carefully orchestrated fantasy. Charles's grip on Naomi's wrist had become the center of gravity for the entire room. In that connection of flesh and force, everything else orbited: wealth and poverty, power and powerlessness, the assumption of superiority, and the reality of shared humanity. It was a tableau as old as civilization itself, played out in 1,000 variations, but tonight it would end differently. Because tonight, the invisible woman had a secret. Tonight, the puppet master was ready to cut the strings. Tonight, in a ballroom that had hosted presidents and kings, a billionaire was about to learn that some mistakes cost more than money, more than reputation, more than pride. Some mistakes cost everything. Sterling reached them, his presence making Charles instinctively release Naomi's wrist. She stepped back, rubbing the red marks his fingers had left, still watching him with that unbearable pity. The old man positioned himself between them, his body language shifting the entire dynamic of power in the room. "Charles," Sterling said again, and this time the name sounded like an epitaph. "Let me properly introduce someone." The countdown to destruction had reached 0. In the next 30 seconds, William Sterling would speak 7 words that would detonate like a nuclear bomb in the heart of Charles Blackstone's carefully constructed world. The cameras would capture every second. The world would watch it all unfold. And Naomi Washington, minimum wage waitress, invisible servant, keeper of secrets, would finally step into the light. "Naomi Washington," William Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. "My adopted daughter." The words landed like artillery shells in the sudden silence. Charles Blackstone's face went through a series of micro-expressions that the surrounding cameras captured in high definition. Confusion, disbelief, the dawning horror of understanding. His brain, that finely tuned instrument of calculation and cruelty, stuttered and stalled like a flooded engine. "You're... what?" The question escaped him in a whisper, champagne still dripping from his jacket onto Italian leather shoes that suddenly felt like they were sinking into quicksand. Sterling's eyes never left Charles's face as he continued with surgical precision. 15 years ago, I lost my biological daughter in a car accident. Emily was 11, same age as Naomi when I met her at a Brooklyn group home during what was supposed to be a routine charity visit. His voice carried no emotion, just facts delivered like evidence in a court where Charles had already been convicted. I spent 4 hours that day teaching her chess. Do you know what struck me most? Not her intelligence, though she beat me twice. It was how she shared her lunch with a younger boy who'd had his stolen, even though it meant she went hungry. The math was simple enough that even the champagne-soaked circuits of Charles's brain could process it. He had just physically assaulted, publicly humiliated, and hurled racial slurs at the daughter of the man who controlled his company's future. The man whose signature on tomorrow's documents would unlock $2 billion in funding. The man who could destroy him with a phone call. "William, I had no idea." Charles's voice had lost all its commanding resonance, reduced to the pleading tone of that 12-year-old boy in the cafeteria. His hands, which moments ago had gripped Naomi's wrist like a vice, now trembled visibly. "Of course you didn't," Sterling replied, his tone sharpening. "Because to you, she was invisible. Just another servant to abuse, another target for your performed cruelty. But that's the beauty of this experiment, Charles. I wanted Naomi to see how power reveals character when it thinks no one important is watching." He paused, letting the weight of judgment settle. "And you've revealed yours magnificently." Naomi stepped forward then, and in one fluid motion that seemed choreographed by fate itself, she reached up and unpinned her hair, letting it fall in natural waves around her shoulders. With the same deliberate grace, she unbuttoned the serving jacket to reveal an elegant designer dress beneath, the kind of dress that belonged at the tables, not serving them. The transformation was subtle but complete, from invisible servant to someone who belonged in their world more than they did. "You know what's funny, Mr. Blackstone?" Naomi's voice was steady, carrying the kind of quiet authority that didn't need volume to command attention. "You donate $10 million a year to inner-city youth programs. Your foundation has probably helped thousands of kids who look just like me. But you can't even see the humanity in someone serving you drinks." She tilted her head, studying him with those eyes that still held that devastating pity. "I've watched you for 6 months. Every cruel word, every casual humiliation, every time you made someone feel small just because you could. And I kept wondering, what broke inside you to make you this way?" Charles's mind was racing, trying to find an angle, a play, a way to salvage something from this catastrophe. But every move on the board led to checkmate. Around them, the phones kept recording, red lights blinking like eyes of judgment. He could already see tomorrow's headlines, feel his stock price plummeting, hear his board calling for his head. "The deal," he managed, his voice cracking. "The IPO, $2 billion. William, surely we can discuss. The deal is dead." Sterling's words fell like a judge's gavel. "As of this moment. My lawyers will send the formal withdrawal in the morning, but let me be crystal clear. Sterling Fund will never, under any circumstances, invest a single cent in any venture connected to you." The ripple effect was immediate and visible. The other investors at the table leaned back as if Charles had become radioactive. The Dubai contingent exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their own sudden recalculations. The whispers started at nearby tables and spread outward like wildfire, carrying the news that Charles Blackstone had just committed financial suicide in front of 200 witnesses. "You set me up," Charles said, the accusation desperate and hollow. "This whole thing, you planned this." Sterling's smile was thin as a blade. "I gave you exactly what you've always had, a choice. Every day for 6 months, you chose cruelty. Tonight, you chose to grab my daughter's wrist and demand she kneel. No one forced those words from your mouth. No one made you reveal exactly who you are when you think no one important is watching." He straightened his tie with the air of a man finishing distasteful but necessary business. "The only setup here was the one you created for yourself." The cameras had captured everything. Charles's transformation from corporate titan to desperate supplicant, Naomi's revelation as someone who belonged in their world more than most of them, Sterling's methodical destruction of a man who'd built an empire on the suffering of others. But the final twist was still coming, visible in the cold satisfaction playing at the corners of Sterling's mouth. "Oh, and Charles," Sterling added, as if remembering a minor detail. "That champagne you're wearing, it's from my personal collection, the 2002 Dom Perignon Rosé Richard Geoffroy edition. $20,000 a bottle. Consider it my parting gift, the most expensive drink you'll ever wear, and the last thing my money will ever buy you." The laughter that rippled through the room wasn't kind. It was the sound of hyenas recognizing that the alpha had fallen, that the pecking order was reshuffling, that blood was in the water, and everyone wanted their bite. Charles Blackstone stood there, champagne-soaked and destroyed, finally understanding that in the chess game of power, he'd never been the king. He'd always been a pawn, and Naomi Washington, the invisible waitress, the woman he'd tried to force to her knees, had just swept him off the board. By 10:15 p.m., the first video had already garnered 50,000 views. Blackstone Racist began trending locally as guests uploaded their footage before the valet even brought their cars. The New York social media ecosystem, always hungry for the mighty fallen, devoured the content with algorithmic efficiency. Charles Blackstone, still standing in his champagne-soaked suit, watched his destruction proliferate across screens throughout the ballroom as guests openly scrolled through their feeds, no longer pretending politeness. "Sir, perhaps we should—" Sarah Mitchell appeared at his elbow, her earlier humiliation forgotten in the face of this greater catastrophe. But Charles wasn't listening. He was watching a future he'd spent 20 years building dissolve in real time, measured in retweets and angry comments. By midnight, the video had crossed 1 million views. The headline variations multiplied like a virus. Billionaire CEO's racist meltdown. Tech titans 2B bigotry. The waitress who destroyed a Fortune 500 CEO. News outlets began reaching out to witnesses. 3 separate guests had captured the full exchange in 4K clarity, including Charles's hand gripping Naomi's wrist, his face contorted with rage, the racial slur that would echo through his nightmares. At 3:47 a.m., Charles sat in his home office, hitting refresh on his phone with the compulsion of a gambler pulling slot machine levers. Each update brought fresh catastrophe. The Dubai investors had released a statement. "We do not conduct business with individuals who demonstrate such deplorable values." The London consortium's withdrawal was more surgical. "After reviewing tonight's events, we've determined that Blackstone Technologies represents an unacceptable reputational risk." By the time markets opened at 9:30 a.m., Blackstone Technologies was hemorrhaging value. The stock opened down 23% and fell from there, triggering automatic trading halts as it plummeted past circuit breakers. Charles watched from his office, unshaven and still wearing yesterday's ruined shirt, as 20 years of work evaporated into digital smoke. The board called an emergency meeting for 2 p.m. Charles knew what was coming, had seen it happen to others who'd committed lesser sins. They arrived like pallbearers, these men and women who'd praised his ruthlessness when it made them money. Now that same ruthlessness had become a liability, and corporations had no loyalty except to their stock price. "Charles, you have to understand our position." Harrison, the lead director, couldn't meet his eyes. "The institutional investors are threatening to pull out entirely. Microsoft is reconsidering all contracts. The talent exodus has already begun. 3 VPs resigned this morning." "Over one incident?" Charles's voice was hoarse from a sleepless night spent leaving voicemails that went unreturned. One moment. Harrison's diplomatic mask slipped. "Charles, you assaulted a woman, on camera, while shouting racial slurs, at a charity event. The woman turned out to be William Sterling's daughter. Sterling, who controls more capital than some countries' GDP. This isn't an incident. It's corporate Chernobyl." The vote was 11-1. The only dissent came from Charles himself, a futile gesture that only emphasized his isolation. Security escorted him from the building he'd entered that morning as CEO, past employees who avoided eye contact and reporters who shouted questions like accusations. Over the following days, the dominoes fell with mechanical precision. 17 major clients terminated contracts, citing values misalignment. The company's diversity committee resigned en masse. 3 class action lawsuits materialized, alleging systemic discrimination. Suddenly, every employee Charles had ever berated felt empowered to speak. His personal attorneys, sensing which way the wind was blowing, recommended he prepare for significant settlements. Meanwhile, at Sterling Fund headquarters, Naomi Washington walked through halls she'd visited in secret for years, now openly acknowledged as William Sterling's daughter and newest Director of Corporate Ethics and Investment Strategy. Her first act was to implement the Humanity Clause. Any company seeking Sterling funding would undergo a comprehensive culture assessment, including anonymous employee interviews about executive behavior. "Some will call it radical," she told the assembled partners, wearing a suit that cost more than her old monthly salary. "But we're not just investing in companies. We're investing in the future we want to see, and that future has no room for leaders who see cruelty as strength." The financial press dubbed it the Naomi effect, a sudden scrutiny of executive behavior that sent shockwaves through corporate America. CEOs who'd built careers on fear found themselves desperately enrolling in sensitivity training. Companies rushed to implement anonymous reporting systems. The phrase, "don't pull a Blackstone," entered the business lexicon as shorthand for self-destructing through arrogance. Charles's attempts at damage control resembled a man trying to bail out the Titanic with a teacup. His Twitter apology, crafted by crisis management experts who charged him $50,000 for advice he didn't follow, was ratioed into oblivion within hours. The press conference he insisted on holding drew only 15 reporters, all of whom came to witness the spectacle rather than offer redemption. His attempts to reach Sterling directly resulted in 47 unanswered calls and a cease and desist letter from Sterling's legal team. Within a month, Charles Blackstone's net worth had plummeted from $5 billion to $50 million, most of it locked in legal battles he was destined to lose. The man who'd measured his worth in others' fear found himself afraid. Of bankruptcy, of irrelevance, of the isolation he'd crafted for others now surrounding him like a prison of his own making. The security footage from the Ritz-Carlton that night became required viewing at business schools, a case study in how 2 minutes of revealed character could destroy 2 decades of carefully constructed success. Frame by frame, students analyzed the moment Charles grabbed Naomi's wrist, the instant Sterling spoke those fatal words, the transformation of a billionaire into a cautionary tale. But perhaps the most telling detail was what happened in the 58th second of the original video, just before Charles's tirade. If you looked closely, enhanced the image just right, you could see Naomi's expression in the moment before the champagne spilled. She wasn't looking at the glasses or the crowd or even the man who would soon destroy himself. She was looking directly into the camera, and she was almost smiling. 1 month after the Ritz-Carlton incident, Naomi Washington stood before a conference room filled with Sterling Fund's most senior partners, presenting the first quarterly report on what financial media had dubbed the Humanity Initiative. The numbers told a story of revolution disguised as evolution. 500 companies had voluntarily adopted the new assessment standards, hoping to avoid their own Blackstone moment. Workplace dignity violations are down 30% across our portfolio companies, Naomi reported, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd earned their seat at the table through more than birthright. Anonymous reporting is up 400%, not because there's more abuse, but because employees finally believe there will be consequences. The conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows framed Manhattan's skyline, the same towers of power she'd once served champagne in, now spread before her like a chessboard where she finally had pieces to move. At 26, she was the youngest director in Sterling Fund's history, but no one questioned her appointment. They'd all seen the video. They all understood that in the new economy of accountability, she was fluent in a language they were still learning to speak. The ripple effects had spread far beyond Sterling Fund. Harvard Business School had already commissioned a case study. The $2 billion slur, leadership, accountability, and the true cost of corporate culture. Professor Amanda Chen, who'd written it, noted that Charles Blackstone's downfall represented more than individual failure. It was a referendum on an entire system that had rewarded sociopathy as strength. Congress had fast-tracked the Workplace Dignity Act, legislation that had languished in committee for years, suddenly finding bipartisan support. Senator Patricia Williams, who'd been at the gala that night, spoke passionately on the Senate floor. When we allow leaders to dehumanize those they consider beneath them, we corrode the very foundation of our society. The Blackstone incident wasn't an aberration, it was a mirror, and we didn't like what we saw. The real measure of change came in smaller moments. A CEO in Silicon Valley, known for his volcanic temper, was filmed apologizing to a janitor he'd screamed at. The video went viral, but this time as a positive example. "I watched what happened to Charles," he admitted. "Made me realize I'd been him, just with better PR. That's not who I want to be anymore." Meanwhile, Charles Blackstone had become a ghost haunting his own life. His days were spent in a rented office in Queens, his Manhattan penthouse long since sold to cover legal fees, filing job applications that disappeared into digital voids. 237 applications, 0 callbacks. His reputation preceded him like a plague warning. his name toxic to any organization that valued its brand. The irony wasn't lost on him as he sat in a community college classroom teaching ethical leadership in modern business for $45,000 a year, less than he used to spend on a watch. His students, mostly working adults trying to better themselves, didn't recognize him at first. When they eventually Googled their instructor and discovered his history, the classroom became a living laboratory in redemption and skepticism. I spent 38 years believing that power meant making others feel powerless, he told them during one late evening session, fluorescent lights humming overhead. I measured my worth in fear, counted my victories in humiliations. It took losing everything to understand that I'd never had anything worth keeping. Some students walked out, others stayed to challenge him, to probe whether his transformation was genuine or performed. Charles answered every question, accepted every accusation, understanding that this purgatory of accountability was the only path forward. When one student, a black woman named Denise, who worked 2 jobs while raising 3 kids, asked him why she should believe anything he said, he had no easy answer. "You shouldn't," he admitted. "Trust is earned through consistent action over time. All I can do is show up, do the work, and hope that someday my actions might speak louder than my worst moment." The Naomi effect had evolved beyond corporate governance into a cultural touchstone. Pull a Blackstone had entered everyday vocabulary, but so had do a Naomi, standing up to power with dignity intact. The original video had been viewed over 1 billion times, analyzed in sociology courses, dissected in ethics seminars, memed and remixed until it became less about the individuals involved and more about what it represented. William Sterling, in a rare public appearance at the Fortune Global Forum, reflected on the night that changed everything. "People ask if I planned it," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades in business. "The truth is simpler and more complex. I gave my daughter a job serving champagne to billionaires because I wanted her to see how power behaves when it thinks no one important is watching. What happened that night wasn't orchestrated. It was inevitable. Charles Blackstone wasn't unique. He was typical. That's why it resonated." The audience, CEOs and founders, titans and disruptors, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. How many of them had their own Charles Blackstone moments buried in the past? How many were one viral video away from destruction? At her desk high above Manhattan, Naomi reviewed the latest batch of funding applications. Each company's culture report lay beside its financials, weighted equally in the evaluation. She thought of Marcus, who'd finally received proper care thanks to her new salary, now working part-time as a peer counselor for other young people with disabilities. She thought of all the invisible people still serving champagne to those who saw them as furniture. Her assistant knocked. Sarah Mitchell, who'd left Blackstone Technologies to join Sterling Fund, drawn by the promise of working somewhere that valued humanity alongside profitability. "The 3 o'clock is here," Sarah announced. "The rehabilitation program applicants." Naomi smiled. Today she would interview former executives who'd lost everything through their own cruelty, now seeking funding for programs to help others avoid their mistakes. It was ambitious, probably naive, certainly controversial. But change always was. 5 years later, Naomi Washington stood at the podium of the United Nations Global Compact, addressing an audience of world leaders and Fortune 500 CEOs. At 31, she had become the youngest black female billionaire in history, but the title that mattered more was the one on the conference program: Architect of the New Capitalism. 5 years ago, she began, her voice carrying across the assembly hall, I was on my knees in spilled champagne while a billionaire called me worthless. Today, that moment has been viewed 2 billion times, studied in 1,000 classrooms, and sparked reforms in 50 countries. But this isn't a story about revenge or even justice. It's about the price we pay. All of us. when we forget that power without humanity is just tyranny in a better suit. The statistics on the screen behind her told the story in numbers. Workplace discrimination lawsuits down 73% globally. 50,000 companies now operating under humanity standards. Employee satisfaction at historic highs. Productivity, surprisingly, up across all sectors. Turns out people work better when treated as humans rather than resources. In the audience, Charles Blackstone sat in the back row, invitation personally extended by Naomi herself. His journey from billionaire to pariah to whatever he was now had been documented in his book, The Fall: How I Lost Everything and Found My Soul. Critics called it self-serving. Supporters saw genuine transformation. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between. After teaching at community colleges for 2 years, Charles had applied to Sterling Fund's rehabilitation program. The interview process was grueling. 6 months of psychological evaluation, community service verification, and most challenging face-to-face meetings with people he'd hurt during his reign of corporate terror. Sarah Mitchell had been one of his references, a forgiveness that still stunned him. Now he served as director of the Second Chances Initiative, helping former executives who'd destroyed their careers through cruelty find paths to redemption. His office, a modest space in Sterling Fund's building, bore no resemblance to his former corporate palace. The only decoration was a framed photo from the Ritz-Carlton that night, a reminder of the moment everything changed. Mr. Blackstone asked me an important question during his interview. Naomi continued from the podium. He asked if I could forgive him. I told him forgiveness wasn't mine to give. It belonged to everyone he'd hurt along the way. But I could offer something else. The chance to prove that people can change, that our worst moments don't have to define us forever. The Ritz-Carlton's presidential ballroom had been renamed the Washington Sterling Memorial Hall, with a bronze plaque by the entrance. In this room, we learned that dignity has no price, but disrespect costs everything. The space now hosted monthly forums on ethical leadership, with speakers ranging from reformed executives to service workers sharing their stories. Marcus Washington had graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School, his studies funded by the scholarship program Naomi established. He now worked as a neurologist specializing in treating children with cerebral palsy, turning his own struggles into hope for others. At every appointment, he told parents, "My sister taught me that limitations are just starting points for innovation." As Naomi concluded her UN address, she thought about the interconnected web of consequences that had spiraled from one moment of cruelty. Every day, in offices and restaurants, factories and boardrooms, we make choices about how to treat those around us. These seem like small decisions, personal moments that affect only the people in the room. But we've learned that there's no such thing as a private cruelty in a connected world. Every action ripples outward, shaping the future we're building together. The applause was sustained, but Naomi was already thinking ahead. Tomorrow she would review funding applications, mentor young entrepreneurs, continue the work of reshaping capitalism into something that served humanity rather than consuming it. The transformation was far from complete. Systemic change measured in generations, not news cycles. But as she left the podium, passing Charles Blackstone in the back row, she saw him mouth 2 words. Thank you. Not for forgiveness, not for redemption, but for the chance to earn both through action rather than words. Outside, Manhattan gleamed in the afternoon sun, its towers of power casting long shadows. Somewhere in those buildings, a CEO was deciding whether to humiliate an assistant. A manager was choosing between compassion and cruelty. A service worker was being seen or ignored. Each choice mattered. Each moment could be the one that changed everything. The price of power without humanity had been definitively set. Everything you've built, everything you are, everything you might have been. The cost of kindness, by comparison, was free. The world was slowly learning to do the math.